theme of this day, in many ways, is we sort of arbitrarily divided it into domestic and foreign policy, but one of the leitmotifs of Angelo's scholarship is this question of the ruling class and the country class, which he famously brought forth in an American Spectator article in 2010, which turned into a little book. Incidentally, we've just played a part in having it reissued by a press with a new introduction from Michael Anton. So if any of you want a copy, please let us know. Happy to send you one. We've got a bunch. It's a wonderful thing to have in hardcover and to keep revisiting. But Angelo's point was, all these people, Bill Casey, Turner, all sorts of well-meaning patriots over the years. It's not that they were bad people. It's that they were educated at the same schools. They were brought up in the same fundamentally progressive mindset of both domestic and foreign policy, which for Angelo really got going and gathered its first initial head of steam at the turn of the 20th century and really captured both parties. And that animated a lot of his work. And so you can imagine over the years the incredulity with which people who made their livelihoods from this way of doing government, foreign and domestic, would take great offense at being punctured and intelligently criticized. So in that spirit, let's start our first panel. Thank you. So for our first panel, putatively on domestic policy, let me just introduce our speakers quickly. They'll be known to most of you. We'll start with David Corbin. David is Chief Academic Officer at American Classical Education Foundation. But David was also one of Angelo's last grad students, if not the last. David can correct me.
Be one of two.
One of two of his last graduate students at Boston University. Steve Hayward, who all of you know well from his many ventures over the years, longtime friend of the Claremont Institute, one-time employee, now an inmate at the University of California, Berkeley, as he says, and peripatetic writer, speaker, and overall great American. I'll say that of all panelists, they're all great Americans. Dan McCarthy is editor at Modern Age and a senior scholar at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, although I may have gotten that title may need emendation, so I leave that to Dan. But Dan is also a proud, to speak for him, a former Lincoln Fellow of the Claremont Institute. And so with that, we'll start with David. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you to Neil Freeman and the Claremont Institute and Hillsdale for hosting this event. I think this conference on Angelo Codevilla is incredibly important because I think after his death, there was still a question there as to just what he was trying to accomplish. And one of the most common reactions that I heard after his death among friends was how unfortunate it was that he would no longer be able to provide his unique commentary on all things present, especially at a time when we needed him most. And for good reason. Many came to depend upon his well-thought-out opinions on everything under the sun. It would be an easy thing for us to think of him as our favorite, or at least most refreshing, public intellectual. For many, though, Angelo was largely unknown, and for those more critical of his writings, he was lazily caricatured as a war hawk, right-wing polemicist, or champion of populist revolt. I often asked him near the end of his life if he ever tired of the continual give and take on all things political, or was bothered by these somewhat misleading representations. He replied that while he'd much rather be spending time reading Plato and Cicero, this was essential work. Overall, he seemed at ease with this task, recognizing his important part in what he termed a civilizational quarrel. In trying to make better sense of his writings as a whole, I trust more now than ever that he knew his part well. Let me explain. Whenever taking on a subject, Codevilla almost invariably followed a standard approach. First, ask simple questions. What is the purpose of this thought, activity, or choice? Why do you think, do, or choose this rather than something else? Do you think, do, or choose this for the sake of that, or vice versa? By what criteria do you judge your thoughts, actions, or choices good or bad? Second, consider answers in terms of why is this good, or why is this bad? And then third, judge the thought, action, or choice using the standard of truth as embodied in correct A, language, B, reasoning, and C, correspondence to reality. I think the best way to understand Angelo Codevilla is to ask the same questions of him and to judge his work accordingly. For this afternoon, I'd like to focus on the purpose of his thought that I think is closely tied to the manner in which he wrote, taught, and spoke. Angelo Codevilla's purpose was to teach politics to an audience that, by and large, had been misled on a wide variety of the most important aspects of the human experience: war and peace, knowledge and ignorance, truth and falsehood, reality and imagination, and the difference between good and bad thinking, good and bad ideas, good and bad choices, and good and bad consequences. In his introduction to his translation of Machiavelli's Prince, he explained how we arrived at this point. The difference between how humans ought to think, make choices, and live, and how they think, make choices, and live, varied. Yet more recently in human history, men had become more accustomed to a more static understanding of the distinction between the ought and the is, to the point of annihilating the difference between the two. Why? Here, Codevilla would not be the first or last thinker to point to the influence of the fountainhead of modern political thought, Niccolo Machiavelli, as one of the primary causes of the shift in how men understood good and evil. Both Codevilla's teacher, Leo Strauss, and fellow students and adherents of Strauss had put forth persuasive arguments that Machiavelli's attempt to introduce new orders had effectively encouraged this shift. What made Codevilla unique is what he would thereafter make of this important discovery. And as a personal aside, studying political philosophy and political philosophers as a young man, one of the great pleasures of becoming an initiate to a careful reading of texts was the belief that you had access to an explanation of why human beings did what they did that was rare. This sense of self-importance is well captured by Scott Adams' Dilbert principle, the idea that our world is populated by nearly 6 billion ninnies, living in a civilization that was designed by a few thousand amazing smart deviants. I still remember a comic strip on the title page of my undergraduate politics course that had a Machiavellian-looking political philosopher writing at a desk with a politician giving a speech to a crowd below him and armed soldiers pointing bayonets at political enemies at the bottom of the page. Ideas have consequences. To know more than others, the object must be to study and recognize the greatness of idea makers. When I met Angelo Codevilla a few years later as a Ph.D. student and relayed a similar sentiment and worldview, he was only mildly amused and rather unimpressed. He was usually unimpressed. As a native Italian, he had been contacted by Yale University Press to edit and translate Machiavelli's Prince. He suggested that reading Machiavelli in Italian was even more interesting and that the difference was important. The Prince, Codevilla argued, had become the fountainhead of modern political thought 20 years after it was written, not because of the events it describes, but because of the manner in which it was written. A seductive, accessible retelling of Thrasymachus' claim in the Republic that justice is the interest of the stronger. For Codevilla, Machiavelli had taught us that all of us, princes and people alike, in what matters most, for Codevilla, Machiavelli had taught us that all of us, princes and people, are alike in what matters most, our relative strength or lack thereof. In other words, the strong and the weak do what they can, and the weak and the strong suffer what they must. There is no peace for anyone. Codevilla asks whether we should accept this premise or question it. Whereas, quote, the problem of what Machiavellian men do is not easily dealt with, he suggested that it is not impossible to deal with. The best response to Machiavelli involved trying to figure out what was true, restating it confidently, and with real-world, tangible examples that show what men do at any given time depends on what habits they acquired. And thus the character of men and of nations depends on whether their habits are good or bad. Few were in a better position to discuss the different character of nations and differences between nations than Codevilla. His varied experience, he explained, quote, strengthened my awe for the countervailing powers of habit and contingency. In The Character of Nations, Codevilla examined that what men do sometimes involves following old patterns and sometimes involved following new modes and orders. This is key. Codevilla hoped that by reintroducing the concept of regimes to modern readers and by developing the theme that peoples and nations affect the quality of their lives by how they govern themselves, that they may choose to govern themselves better rather than to default to Machiavelli's universal description of what men do. So in this work, while Codevilla would forego a detailed description of the world's regimes, the turn from Machiavelli's science of politics to Aristotle's science of politics reconsidered and applied to modern life required a continual and detailed examination of the important particulars of any given situation. Here note that a constant in all Codevilla's works, whether writing on the nature of intelligence, statecraft, foreign policy, or the character of nations, was his emphasis on understanding the circumstances men found themselves in, how they employed their moral, intellectual, and physical agency, and what were the consequences, good, bad, or in between. So what do men do, and how do they live? Well, in two of his favorite words, it depends. It depends. It depends is his retort to Machiavelli. But it wasn't simply what Codevilla wrote, spoke, or acted that defined his purpose, but also the manner in which he wrote, spoke, and acted. Here again, his commentary on Machiavelli is helpful. In his essay, Words and Power, Codevilla emphasizes Machiavelli's ability to change the meanings of words. As much as Codevilla was interested in employing words to help order our understanding of human affairs, Machiavelli used language to disorder. For Machiavelli, the most effective way was to employ language accessible to the less discriminating tastes. Here, Codevilla notes that Machiavelli intentionally departed from Dante, who believed, quote, that the function of language is to describe the nature of things. To the extent that men understand the place of everything in a divinely ordered natural hierarchy, they may attune themselves to reality. Words express men's best understanding of how every place of reality fits with every other's. Machiavelli's use of language, on the other hand, was intentionally strategic. He wrote the way Mets manager Casey Stengel spoke. I can say this because I'm a Braves fan. Here's a good example of Casey Stengel. The Mets have shown me more ways to lose than I could have ever imagined. I think part of Codevilla's success as a writer was to write with similar effect, but to do so in a manner that tied the use of such language to a true, good, and noble cause. There may be no better display of this talent than the epigraphs at the beginning of his most well-known work, The Ruling Class, How They Corrupted America, and what we can do about it. The first, all men are created equal. The second, which he said someone on the street would always say, but he'd say it to me all the time, who the hell do they think they are? Corbin, who the hell do they think they are? He'd say it over and over and over again. I think to understand Codevilla, you have to understand that he's a man who believed so strongly on the one hand that all men are created equal, so much so that he could do, on the other hand, who the hell do they think they are? To judge whether Codevilla's effort was good and bad or accurate with regard to his use of the dictionary, reasoning, and correspondence, I'll leave for later. But I think there's one story that Rush Limbaugh says at the beginning of his introduction to the ruling class that I think tells a lot here about why Codevilla wrote the way that he did and whether or not it was a good thing. I mean, by the way, how many people who have Ph.D.s in political philosophy would allow someone as low as Rush Limbaugh to write an introduction to their work? Took some guts, right? But this story from Rush is great. He's antique shopping in Paris, and he comes upon a relic that caught his eye. And noting the interest that Limbaugh has in the piece, the dealer chimes in, "This is an important piece." And Rush writes, "He was trying to inflate the price and stroke my ego, and it didn't work." Rush replied, "Important to whom? Important to whom?" He says, "I very seldom use the word important, but no one had to tell me that Angelo Codevilla's The Ruling Class was important. It dovetails with something I've been trying to explain for 20 years. Namely, people never get out of high school. Want to be a part of the big clique dominates their lives. It's a quest for power, for acceptance, for belonging in the in crowd, however it's defined. I've also been stung and very much influenced by Harvey Mansfield's thought that the central question in politics is how important is he? How important are we? Politics is about who deserves to be more important. And I think in many ways, Codevilla would agree with that statement. But for Codevilla, much more important than who is important is what is important. And of the greatest importance is capital T truth and to not live by lies. That was the Codevilla that I knew. Thank you.
Well, let me say that it's really a delight to be in the company of so many true conservatives. True conservatives, I define these days, are those rare people who didn't support Donald Trump until after January 6th. You had all this talk from the media for 4 years about, he was an authoritarian and a populist bully. And I said, finally, what took you so long, right? That's actually, some of you who know conservative folklore will recognize that's a derivative joke from Stan Evans. And when I did my recent biography of Stan, I had not appreciated this all the years I knew Stan and had worked for him 40 years ago, that he was a huge fan of Angelo's, and they were friends. And during the 70s, when Stan Evans was starting the American Conservative Union, he had Angelo come and speak, usually on arms control and related foreign issues, as often as he possibly could. And of course, as everyone knows, Angelo is best known for his work on grand strategy, intelligence, arms control. But my proposition is, if we could place ourselves in that imaginary world in which there was no foreign conflict and military strategy was unnecessary or didn't exist, Angelo would have emerged as one of the premier social thinkers of our time, mentioned in the same breath with, say, James Q. Wilson or Charles Murray. And when you start drawing out the parallels, and I'll do this in order in a minute, or try to, you realize that his perspective on domestic affairs is in harmony with his views on foreign affairs. There's a unity to them. That's the important point. But that unity actually explodes one of the familiar intellectual dichotomies of modern times, which is the supposed separation of foreign policy and domestic policy. That's the way we talk about it in conventional politics, right? And candidates for president or presidents in office. We always say Reagan's domestic policy, Reagan's foreign policy, so forth. That's one of the conceits of modern scientific politics, and yet another means of diminishing the proper role of political argument in public affairs. So let's start out with the old familiar cliche that partisan differences end at the water's edge. We don't say that as much as we used to, and one reason is it was never true, of course. But that illusion, or the maintenance of that cliche for such a long time, buttressed the pretensions to rule of an expert foreign policy class. So as a thought experiment, try imagining, say, Henry Kissinger or Hans Morgenthau having anything serious to say about a domestic policy matter like welfare, or crime in the streets, or tax rates. Not even George Kennan, at his semi-conservative moralist best, had anything really intelligent ever to say about domestic politics. But Angelo had a lot to say. We've already mentioned his book, The Character of Nations, How Politics Makes and Breaks Prosperity, Family, and Civility, first published in 1997 and then updated in 2009. There, Angelo brought his characteristic originality and style and clarity to the essential unity of politics. So the premise of that book and his thought is pretty straightforward. There is a logic to modern regimes, and this fundamental logic affects America. Someone can, I hope, correct me if I'm mistaken about this, but I don't recall ever seeing Angelo use the phrase American exceptionalism in any of his writings. You think I'm right about that? Yeah, and if you asked him about that phrase, I think what he would do first is snort at it. Not because what people mean by it is wrong, quite the opposite. He'd think it is right, but he would think it is being used too superficially. He would think that a lot of people who champion American exceptionalism for the right reasons nonetheless commit the error of supposing that our unique character makes us immune to, or an exception to, the fundamental forces that can ruin a nation and a people. And so Angelo's great talent was always, whether it was foreign policy or domestic policy, able to put familiar problems in a new context and with a different vocabulary. That's always very useful. Here I think he's following the example of Machiavelli. His translation's been mentioned. His translation, by the way, came out the same year as The Character of Nations. I don't know how he does these things simultaneously like he did. And I think his translation really does, I don't know Italian, but I think it rivals Harvey Mansfield's in terms of its trying to be literal, but also giving copious notes explaining the shadings and subtleties of different terms. And I've actually tried to compare them once in a while in different passages just to see what could come from them. It's an interesting exercise to try. And of course, one of the things he says in the excellent introduction to his translation is that for Machiavelli, language was the ultimate tool, the ultimate, how do you put it? I've lost my place, my notes. Language is the, well, I'll quote him here, language is a weapon in human struggles. That's what he said. I found my place. Because language changes the categories and ways that we think about things, right? So he wrote, and this is all very prescient of our current time, which I don't need to explain to anybody, where men can be women and so forth, right? If a language is to be structured as to make impossible the articulation of certain thoughts, those thoughts will be banished forever from the minds of those who speak that language. And so here we are, right? Think back just for a moment. In the next panel, we'll talk about this at some greater length, of course. The bracing clarity he brought to the whole foreign policy world. I always loved his definition of détente. Détente was a sophisticated attempt to bribe the Soviets not to use their guns. That's not the way Henry Kissinger ever described it. The collapse of the Soviet Union. I still run into people these days, especially lefties who are, reasonably intelligent, but they always like to say, well, it was modernization and convergence and economic sclerosis, all that, how less to that. Angelo said, quote him here, the proximate cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union was the communist waning will to murder. I mean, by the way, if all those other theories about, economic sclerosis and modernization, how come North Korea is still with us? yeah, there's some difficulties there. So, now we've already made reference to his book on the ruling class, and I just want to deepen what we've already put on the table, which is his understanding or perspective on the problem differs, I think, in important respects from many other theoretical and practical conservative perspectives. And even some of the important issues we talk a lot about, such as the administrative state, the degradation of the Constitution, and the separation of powers, and so forth. He would agree with all of that. But I think we can best appreciate his deeper understanding of the problem and more bracing understanding by going to the end of the book, The Character of Nations, because there he brings up something that I like to bring up with students, what pollsters call the trust question. Late in the book, he mentions the data that goes back to the late 50s when people like Gallup and Harris and the polling companies started asking the American people, do you have confidence or trust in the federal government to do the right thing most of the time or all the time? And in the late 50s, the number of Americans expressing confidence in the federal government was about 80%, 8-0. Anyone know what that number is today? 15, on a good day. And I will often show this chart to students, and I'll actually put the chart up. Have you ever seen it? It starts in the mid-60s. There's a reason why that's the point where it breaks and goes down, 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 and to, from 80 down to about 15 today, 17 if there's a polling error. And I show this to students, usually the first day of class. At Berkeley, class is one giant reclamation project from the first moment. And this, so discussion begins. How did that happen? What's the causes of that? What are the remedies and so forth? It should be mentioned that the only sustained reversal in that trend happened in the 80s when Reagan was president. But even then, it never got over like 50%. It never came anywhere close to the highs it had in the 50s. Now, the standard explanation for this is the growth of government alongside its obviously declining competence. As everyone knows, in the mid-1960s, we launched two large wars that we both lost, the war in Vietnam and the war on poverty at home. But these failures, Angelo thought, were not primarily the results of constitutional decay, of regulatory hubris, of fiscal recklessness, or even centralization. I would agree with all those things are true phenomena, but that's not getting close to the heart of the matter and what really needs to be attacked directly. And I'll add something that's been on my mind for a while, and I think is now evident to everybody after COVID, that the culture of the administrative state, it may be propelled from Washington, but it's self-generating at the local level. About 10 years ago, I started cataloging examples from around the country. I found about 40 of these. The local police or local health officials shutting down lemonade stands by elementary students for health code violations, for not having really, you're going to tell a second grader they need a $500 business license to sling some lemonade on the corner? And I am unaware of any even spurious data saying that there's a lemon juice-borne bacteria posing a threat to public health. Haven't seen that yet. And yet this happens, and the number of places, 40 in a big country doesn't sound like much, but of course the correct number of lemonade stands to be shut down by the police or local government should be 0, right? We have to have lost our minds. And I can give you lots of other examples like that, and then we get to COVID. And what did we see? We saw local governments taking it upon themselves to put bulldozers full of sand in the skate park so the kids wouldn't be outside on their skateboards. Attaching boards or metal to the top of basketball rims on playgrounds, and arresting a lone surfer off the coast in Malibu. That wasn't the federal government that did that. That was locally self-generated idiocy. So the point is, the mentality of the administrative state and the ethos behind it goes all the way down. And likewise, I think a lot of our discussion that you hear every day in the paper, polarization, we're polarized, right? Angelo wrote a lot in the book about what we might call for summary purposes, the increase in public rudeness and general abrasiveness of our culture. Road rage gets mentioned. I'm not quite calling it Karenism yet, but the I want to see the manager mentality, right? All these matters are discussed by conventional thinkers with a kind of clinical sterility that avoids the heart of the matter. Angelo said, "It cannot be an accident that our public nastiness has increased proportionally with our growing spiritual emptiness." Angelo the theologian, almost. Now, my own paraphrase of his thesis is this: there is a malevolent character of our government's incompetence. So, for example, a government that cannot keep dangerously crazy people off our subways and public transportation nonetheless says to us now that it can control the temperature of the planet with a few $1 trillion and banning your gas stove. The latest answer to urban traffic congestion? Bike lanes, right? Which, to my observation, no one uses. It takes us a whole lane away from the cities and deprives us of some parking. For a population that demographically has fewer and fewer people who ought to be riding bicycles on urban streets, I'm just going to say that as an old guy, an ex-cyclist, all of whose friends who still ride bikes have had bad injuries in the last 5 years, because we shouldn't. Okay, you know where that goes. It's like our rulers really don't like how we live. Another small but remarkable example of the perversity of our times. California is considering legislation. You can just stop right there. You know this is going to end crazy, right? They're actually considering a bill in the legislature right now that would, by slow degrees, ban the sales of all tobacco products over the next 20 years, completely. Guess what won't be touched? Marijuana. And at the same time, the state's excessive taxes and regulation of the legal marijuana trade in the state have made it unprofitable. Was something the government wasn't able to do coming out of Prohibition. So Angelo wrote this about the trust gap. "The gap would not have grown so large had there not been a growing recognition by rulers and ruled of the differences in manners and morals, and a growing mutual dislike." It is an interesting thing that, I know polls are crap. Dennis and I were just talking about this. I am a huge consumer of them and critic of them. But one thing I will observe is that there don't seem to be many people who do these surveys who are trying to ask people the kind of questions that Angelo would ask if he had been a pollster. Why do you distrust the government? And probing about some of these things that people think are like banning your gas stove, taking your cigarettes away from you, and so forth. There's one really important example, I think, and very relevant to today in Angelo's book, and it runs against the typical conservative type. So I think everyone with any sense recoils against the impulse behind the defund the police movement of the last few years. But Angelo was early on in perceiving how policing in America had fallen prey to the same bureaucratizing tendencies of the rest of the administrative state. So he wrote in his book, a couple quotes here: "Unionization helped to insulate police from complaints, and bureaucratization and the expansion of their jurisdictions insulated them from their fellow citizens." I'll pause here. There's one more from him that's important. I had one of my best friends who's passed away, but he was a trial lawyer who early in his career used to do some DUI defenses. And he said, the police talk like bureaucrats. So, he'd be cross-examining the arresting officer, and he'd say, "What did you do then?" "I exited the vehicle." "Oh, so you got out of the car." Right? They all start to talk like bureaucratic officials when it used to be it was Murphy the cop, right? It was a working class occupation, and the policeman had the authority and the nightstick he might swat you with, justifiably so, but he was a peer. Now it's not that way. And Angelo expressed some hesitations about the militarization, the over-militarization of the police. But he went further. I'll continue. "The paradigm is this. American police in general seem to have designated as their main enemy, as the criminal they cannot tolerate, the citizens who protect themselves. In fact, the police have effectively lobbied for the disarmament of law-abiding citizens and for punishment of those who take the law into their own hands," end quote. And of course, on our mind right now is the spectacle of New York subways, where, in the absence of any attempt to keep order, we saw last week a citizen who decided to defend himself and his fellow citizens, and who will now likely face prosecution. Angelo saw this coming, saw it already happening 25 years ago. One more sentence from him. "Courts have consistently held individuals acting in undeniable self-defense liable for injuries to the assailant." There aren't many people on use the crude phrase, the law and order right, who talk and think this way, but I think it's useful. Now, I think we could, and Angelo would forgive incompetence and mistakes and failures by government. We certainly forgave them in the Great Depression when most things were counterproductive. If it wasn't so easy to discern that the dominant ethos of our ruling class is wholesale hostility to the American middle class. And I'll just pick three things then as sort of examples he gives, and maybe some possible remedies that might meet with his approval if you told him he had to be a policy wonk, which was really not his favored mode, I think, on domestic policy anyway. He goes on in the book to discuss how our government at all levels has become hostile to families. But he connects it to a larger hostility toward religion and, in fact, the heritage of Western civilization itself. Here, I like to recur to, I think, that great phrase of Roger Scruton about our ruling elites are gripped by a culture of repudiation. It's a good phrase to keep handy. One example he gave, which you may not remember now because it's a while ago, was President Obama going to Georgetown University to give a speech and insisting that the crucifix on the wall be covered up in this Catholic university. Didn't want that in the backdrop of a speech. Well, the point is, a lot of the main ideas conservatives promote these days are, I can't help it, small beer. You might say too many conservatives are trying a Bud Light strategy. Sorry, I can't help it. So what's on our agenda, our wish list? Overturn the Chevron doctrine. Have real cost-benefit analysis for regulation. Require congressional approval for any major regulations through the REINS Act. Let's have a balanced budget and tax cuts uber alles. All good and sensible things to do. All worthy of our support. None of them bold enough to get at the fundamental ethos of our ruling class. So I said I had three ideas. Angelo mentioned in his book that the Japanese, and also it's true of the Scandinavian countries that the left otherwise loves, have very pro-family policies. Japanese tax policy actually tries to encourage and support single-earner households. The best our team can do right now, I think Marco Rubio, is an expanded child care tax credit. How about this, just as an opening idea? How about if we wrote into our tax code that any two-parent families with 3 or more children shall be exempt from income tax? And maybe exempt from the payroll tax, too. I'd go, you're right. I mean, imagine the howls of indignation from the cultural left over this. By the way, I'd want an economist to look at this. There might actually be a supply side effect from this. Angelo, I think, thought there was. He talked about how capitalism and the prosperity of capitalism is the combination of faith and families, not markets. I mean, he disliked Hayek or Friedman or anything like that. He knew Milton Friedman pretty well, but he was, like I say, there's something cultural at the bottom of the matter, not simply tax rates. Okay. Second thing he worried about, he said the problem is if our government is incompetent at home for these malevolent reasons, it will likewise prove unable to defend the country from a serious foreign threat. And he goes through something that has been discussed by many people, the growing divide between elite America and the people who serve in our military, and how few Americans serve in the military anymore. So he doesn't say this, but read between the lines, he kind of thinks maybe we ought to go back to having a draft. I might even be more radical and say, why don't we contemplate universal service? Not the AmeriCorps model where you work in a recycling center at a university, but actually universal service that requires military training. The example he discusses at some length is Switzerland, but also Israel. But Switzerland, and he embraces what Machiavelli said, that Switzerland is the most free because it's the most armed. And you can think through a lot of other collateral effects that might have. Lastly, on religion, I'll just note very briefly and then conclude that the Supreme Court in recent years has been rather friendly to religious liberty, but like all things in constitutional law these days, it usually proceeds on very narrow grounds, or really incremental decisions limited in these little ways. So I'm trying to use some imagination about how Congress and/or state legislatures could provoke some really broad challenges to burst open and reverse the aggressive secular tide against religion. I'm not sure what it might be. It might be something having to do with adoption. We've seen around the country a lot of adoption agencies excluding religious adoption organizations because they won't facilitate adoptions to gay couples and so forth. Let's go attack that directly. I have one. Reagan used to talk about bringing back school prayer. And, it never had a concrete proposal. But Harry Jaffa, one of Angelo's teachers and ours, came up with a great idea once. And I can't believe no one has the imagination for this. Jaffa noted that I think it's 48 of the 50 state constitutions have preambles that sound like the Declaration of Independence. They mention God or the Creator as the source of our rights. Proposal: have every state require that school children in public schools every day recite the preamble of their state constitution, and then dare the federal judiciary to rule that state constitutions are unconstitutional on First Amendment grounds. That would be a fun day, and an argument I think we could win. I'll just conclude with one. This sentence, this is the motto, put it on a business card, and then I'll quit. Angelo said, "When one speaks for one's country, it seems one must speak in terms which can let me do it again. When one speaks for one's country, it seems one must speak in terms which can make rightful claims upon men's faith." Thanks.
No, that's right. While Dan's going up there, I will say that the bureaucraties of law enforcement can be charming when in the mouth of a 4'11" police officer in Asheville, North Carolina, namely my stepsister. Her father was very proud when she was recounting a recalcitrant perp, at which point she took out her tactical baton and assisted him to the ground.
Well, I, have been assisted to the podium, not to the ground. And I think I'll begin my remarks, actually, with an epilogue that will also serve as a prologue to my own thoughts. Steve brought up an interesting comparison between Angelo Codevilla and George Kennan. And I think that's actually a very fruitful comparison. I would disagree with Steve's thought that George Kennan didn't have anything interesting or sensible to say about domestic policy. Kennan did have a couple of, interesting, quite advanced thoughts, really, about domestic policy. In some ways, Kennan was, well ahead of the curve of the current sort of populist moment in America. Kennan was the farthest thing personally from being a populist, but he recognized in the 1990s already that our immigration policy, for example, was a disaster. He also was ahead of the curve on what is now called national divorce. And Kennan, was already speculating in the 1990s that America might simply be too large to govern. Now, Kennan, in contrast to Angelo, Kennan is born in the Midwest in America, and yet he always seems to be rather alienated from his fellow Americans. And Kennan has a very European sensibility. Angelo Codevilla, by contrast, is born in Italy, comes to America as an immigrant, but is a thoroughly American character. And the remarks that others have made about Codevilla's dedication to the idea that all men are created equal, where the hell do they get off kind of mentality. This is, a sharp contrast between Codevilla on the one hand and the very patrician George Kennan on the other. And I think it just speaks to the wonderful, Americanness and the wonderful spirit of the Declaration of Independence that one finds in Angelo. Also, I think that segues nicely into some of the nature of the remarks I want to give today. I'll be talking quite a bit about the ruling class, and in a few respects, this is perhaps the least of Angelo's works. Certainly in terms of length, it's a very small book. It's about 88 pages in its original edition. As you can see, the dimensions are quite small as well. This is not an imposing item to have on your bookshelf. And it's a popular work. It's a work that began as a magazine article in the American Spectator. It was then read aloud to a national audience of millions by Rush Limbaugh on his syndicated radio program. And so this may seem to be something of a departure from Angelo's usual, more scholarly and more expert métier. This is something that seems to be a work in some respects for the masses. And yet that makes it nonetheless characteristic of Angelo himself, because he was a man who, again, believed in true American meritocracy. He believed in the bringing together of great leadership with a public, and a public which consists of equals who can recognize on the merits the superiority of the statesman, the philosopher, the expert, perhaps the plumber, perhaps the soldier. But in any walk of life, what distinguishes one person from another is not their natural quality, they are naturally equal, but rather their achievements, the extent to which they exert themselves, and what they actually accomplish. So the ruling class is a work which, on the surface, seems to be quite popular. It seems to be quite of its moment. It was written at the high tide of the Tea Party movement in 2010, a few months before the 2010 midterm elections, in which the Republicans swept to a massive victory in the House of Representatives and reclaimed control of the House. The TARP bailouts of 2009 and 2008 were still very much the political currency of the age. And Barack Obama's recent election victory in 2008, where he swept into the White House and crushed John McCain. These political features of 2010 are very much at the core of Angelo's text. He's talking about these immediate political concerns, but he's doing much more than simply talking about the news. What he's doing is rather looking behind the headlines, looking behind the momentary wave motion of politics to see the currents and tides of American politics and American civilization behind them. So it actually makes the ruling class, despite its seemingly casual origins and its popular origins, in fact a rather deep work, and a work whose depths should suggest further research and further work for the unofficial students of Angelo today, not necessarily people who, as in David's case, studied with him directly and earned their PhDs under him, but rather all of Angelo's admirers across the country who continue to read his books and continue to think about the philosophy that Angelo tried to convey through all of his great works. Now, the ruling class, as I said, begins with the circumstances of 2010. But Angelo goes beyond the headlines to generalize what is happening. And it's a work that in many respects would seem to be prescient, except Angelo was always careful to say that, in fact, the ruling class is not a prescient book, because it was talking about phenomena that were already quite apparent as Angelo was publishing this work, and that today are only all the more obvious to people who may have been rather oblivious back in 2010. So it's a work that wasn't predicting a future that was yet to come, but rather that understood the present very perfectly in 2010 and saw that that present would continue to grow and to ramify into the kind of order that we have now. So what is this ruling class? You'll see that progressives, in a number of interviews they did with Angelo towards the end of his life, they would often present this idea of the ruling class as some sort of conspiracy theory or something. And you've seen that this is also the attitude they take when someone like Tucker Carlson would talk about the idea that there is a sort of bipartisan establishment in our country. Well, what is this ruling class? How did Angelo define it? Well, first of all, one of the characteristics of the ruling class is that it takes the view that ordinary Americans are incapable of governing themselves. And you'll find that across the institutions of the ruling class, whether you're talking about the Centers for Disease Control, whether you're talking about the major universities, or for that matter, the prestige media in our country, they all have the view that ordinary Americans are incapable of governing themselves because ordinary Americans are both morally and intellectually inadequate. They're intellectually inadequate because, of course, they do not possess the science that they will need in order to make the right decisions, for example, about their own medical care. And they don't possess the science that they need in order to understand that there are, in fact, more than two sexes, or that the very concept of sexes is unscientific, that we should instead be talking about this thing called gender, of which there is a plethora. So, on the one hand, the American people are intellectually incapable of ruling themselves. They lack the scientific expertise necessary to understand the great issues that they are facing and how to navigate them. But also, and perhaps even more importantly, the American people, according to the ruling class, are morally incompetent to govern themselves. The American people are morally incompetent because they are consumed by hatreds and irrational passions and fears which are very destructive of other people. The American people are racist and homophobic. They're still prisoners of patriarchy. And all of these things are moral incapacities. And in order for the American people to be governed well, you will need a governing class, a ruling class, which is not the prisoner of these prejudices, the prisoner of religion and of the concept of the natural family and so forth. Instead, we must have a ruling class that is scientifically elevated beyond such, morally retrograde concepts. So the ruling class sees the American people as being incapable of governing themselves, both intellectually and also morally. The ruling class itself, as Steve quite rightly said, is not simply whoever happens to hold government power. That's a part of it, and government power is actually the essential currency of the ruling class. But the ruling class itself is a frame of mind and a class of people who share an ethos. And that ethos, as Angelo was always careful to point out, actually gets its beginnings among a corrupted intellectual elite. It gets its beginnings in the university, and then it spreads, it takes over government, and it uses government and the powers of government in order to spread its power even further. It also takes control of educational institutions outside of government, in the nonprofit higher education sector, for example. And it takes control of things like the media, the instruments of propagation. Steve had mentioned the importance to Machiavelli of language in shaping the very way that we think. Well, consider the way in which the academy and the media control language, and they also control image, which of course is increasingly an important medium of managing the masses, managing the people, because we have dumbed down the American public to such a degree that images become more and more important, more and more salient. And of course, we saw in 2016 and in recent years that when people do actually start to reclaim the image from the media that otherwise controls it, when you start to see, for example, what are called dank memes proliferating on Twitter, this actually is a threat to the regime. This is actually something that the leadership of Twitter before Elon Musk took it over, and the leadership of Facebook, and talking heads on our televisions and in the newspapers. All of this will be labeled as hate speech. Even if it's just a green frog, that is a hateful symbol. All of these memes that are mocking progressivism, they are seen as being misinformation. Maybe they are actually constructs of a foreign entity of some kind, of perhaps the Kremlin or some other subversive force. So the image is an extremely important power. The image and the word are domains that the ruling class has tried to monopolize. And when it is challenged, it strikes back against any new market entrant by trying to deny them a presence in the market. Now, I said that government power is the currency of the ruling class. One of the key theoretical contributions that Angelo makes to understanding the way in which the ruling class works today, and in contrast to certain other potential ways of understanding the ruling class, is that Angelo says the ruling class is largely characterized by its relationship to government. And again, it isn't simply that the ruling class is the government. It isn't simply that it consists of office holders or even of federal bureaucrats. It's rather that there is an interchange of privileges, of money, and of power and leverage over society that the private institutions of the ruling class and the government engage in and use to come together. The ruling class occupies a kind of hybrid position. It has its tentacles in the private sector, but also very much in government. And it continues to use the combination of government and private self-interest in order to fortify its strength. So when Angelo was writing The Ruling Class, TARP and the bailouts of the banks, the bailouts of various other financial industries and insurance companies and whatnot, these were very much salient in American politics. They had given rise to the Tea Party as a response. Barack Obama, who was elected in 2008 as a candidate of hope and change, by 2010 was seen as someone who really was every bit as much a prisoner of the financial establishment as the Republicans who had preceded him. Remember that around the same time, you're getting also not just the Tea Party, but on the left, the movement called Occupy Wall Street. So even on the left, which is otherwise very enthusiastic about Barack Obama and certainly approves of his cultural agenda, they understand that fundamentally something is going on in our economic system which is not, certainly the conservatives understand it's not a free market, and progressives understand, well, it is a collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. And the left, of course, doesn't want to undo that. They want to simply modify that in a more leftist direction. But even they, in Occupy Wall Street, understood what was happening. So think about all the ways in which what Angelo had already identified as a central phenomenon of the ruling class in 2010 have continued to expand as we are now in 2023. So we've gone from bank bailouts and things like TARP being exceptional back in 2010 to now being the norm. We saw just recently the Silicon Valley Bank collapsed, and government bailed that out. Government is bailing out all kinds of banks, and in fact, right now there is sort of new policy being worked up in order to modify the way in which and expand the way in which government is providing cover for our rather insolvent financial apparatus. But of course, there's so much more. So already at the time Angelo was writing The Ruling Class in 2010, things like environmental policy and green energy were starting to emerge on the scene. But today we see that these forces really are powerful enough that they are starting to redefine capitalism in some ways. And this is one reason why the libertarian critique of state power and government power, the libertarian critique of the Green Movement, for example, isn't deep enough and isn't powerful enough. And Angelo's view of the ruling class is actually more significant than the view that you find among many libertarians. Because while libertarians always view government as the source of the problem and always view it as the thing that is sort of the impetus and the driving force, Angelo understood that in fact ideas are behind even government power, and that government power becomes co-opted by those who have bad ideas and becomes the sort of rope that strangles the American people. And of course, one could say so much more. As Chris Caldwell's recent books have talked about, we also have the use of a combination of government power and corporate power, private power, through HR departments, through the diversity apparatus, through grievance policies and policies that try to manage personal relationships in the workforce, in schools, and in private life, commercial relationships. All of them have come under this comprehensive power. ESG investing, the list is endless. And again, one hesitates to use the term that Angelo himself didn't like, prescient or sort of precognizant, when we're speaking of the ruling class as a book. But Angelo understood already in 2010 many of these forces that would go on to become so much more powerful over our lives today. Now, in contrast to the ruling class, there is what Angelo has called the country class. And this is an important term, an important rediscovery of a term that is essential to American history, and in fact to Anglo-American political history. Now, back in the 17th and 18th centuries, the country party was the party that was opposed not simply to the king and to royal power, but rather to the way in which the king and certain very powerful ministers of his in Parliament were combining their powers to circumvent the Constitution. And in fact, the greatest threat the country party of the 17th and 18th centuries comes to perceive to the English Constitution, the British Constitution, is the way in which Parliament's own cabinet, its own leadership, is able to sort of play both sides. On the one hand, it gains power from having a parliamentary majority, but it's also able to subvert Parliament's authority by drawing upon the king's power of appointment, the king's power to present basically what we would call spoils to cronies within Parliament. So in other words, the king's power is used to bribe members of Parliament, and conversely, that parliamentary majority can be used by the cabinet to intimidate the king, because the king cannot get any policies that he wants to be enacted if a parliamentary majority will not go along with that, and the king's cabinet, by using the king's powers of patronage, are able to manipulate a parliamentary majority. So this was a subversion of the British Constitution that was extremely shocking both to Whigs and also to Tories of the time. So someone like Viscount Bolingbroke, for example, who writes an important work called about the Patriot King, the idea of a Patriot King. This is something that's important to them. It's something that goes on to inspire figures like Thomas Jefferson in the American tradition. They too identify very strongly with this country party tradition in Britain. And you also have a figure like Edmund Burke, often considered the founding father of conservatism. Burke is not quite a country Whig in the old-fashioned tradition, but he is someone who takes very much a country Whig kind of analysis of how the British Constitution can be corrupted, and brings this conception into an idea of more competitive parties, where you will actually not have Parliament being kind of a slave to the cabinet and the king being used, as a source of patronage, but rather if you have competing factions within Parliament, basically modern political parties, you can then have a freer system, a system that actually is truer to the British Constitution than one in which you have overwhelming majorities that are, subjected to corruption. So this, tradition is something that Angelo helped to rediscover by the very use of the term country class. And in juxtaposing the country class to the ruling class, he was bringing into conversation vocabularies from two different traditions. The tradition I've just described of the British country party, but also the vocabulary of Italian elite theory and its discussion of ruling classes. And another thinker that is very important in importing this Italian tradition to the United States was a conservative by the name of James Burnham, who was one of the early editors of National Review. But Burnham actually got his start as a Marxist and, in fact, as one of the leading Trotskyist intellectuals in America shortly before World War II. Burnham, popularizes, on the one hand, an idea of a new kind of economic class, which is taking control of not just America, but in fact, countries all around the world. This new economic class is called the managerial class, or the managerial elite. And Burnham argued in a book called The Managerial Revolution in 1941 that this managerial elite was certainly in power in the Soviet Union, which was not in fact the kind of workers' state that had been imagined by the early communists, but instead was a bureaucracy run by commissars and by this managerial class. The managerial class was also in power in Nazi Germany, which also was a heavily bureaucratized system, and it was in power in America as a result of the New Deal. Now, in response to this managerial takeover of nations all around the world, Burnham started to reinvestigate the traditions of Niccolo Machiavelli and Machiavelli's understanding of elite competition and the ways in which elite competition create opportunities for liberty. So Burnham writes a 1943 book called The Machiavellians, in which he not only talks about Machiavelli, but also a number of other important Italian thinkers such as Vilfredo Pareto, Gaetano Mosca, the Frenchman Georges Sorel, and the German-Italian thinker Roberto Michels. Now, I would say that Angelo Codevilla has helped to put into conversation again the way in which these Italian thinkers and their allies had been conceiving of the Machiavellian competition among elites with this British tradition and this American tradition ultimately that contrasts the country party to the court party, or what we now call the ruling class. I'll just say that I think that in continuing to advance Angelo's work, one can achieve a great deal by deepening this conversation between the country party idea and the country class idea on the one hand, and this analysis of the ruling class and ruling elites on the other, by bringing together great British thinkers with Americans like Codevilla and Burnham, along with Italians from Machiavelli through to Vilfredo Pareto. Now, I will say, the ruling class, Angelo's book, ends on a mostly optimistic but a little bit ambivalent note. He talks about how the popular uprising already in 2010 had come to be. And you could see that in the Tea Party, and of course you would continue to see that in the 2016 election with Donald Trump, and you continue to see it today. So on the one hand, the popular side of things, the revolt against the elite, had already arrived. But the greater challenge, which is mentioned at the very end of Angelo's book, is the idea of what kind of new leadership class you're going to have to replace this corrupt ruling class, and how you're going to build new institutions and new, sort of modes and orders, to use Machiavelli's term, to replace this very, self-serving system that the American political and educational elite has built for itself. And that seems to me to be, a question that Angelo helps to answer through his very life, in the way in which Angelo brought together classical philosophy, an appreciation for the readings that Leo Strauss undertook, together with policy expertise and political engagement and engagement with the American people themselves. Angelo was kind of a Renaissance man of American republicanism in that regard. And so I will leave it at that and commend again all of Angelo's works to all of you. Thank you.
We're running a little over time, but we could take a couple questions if anyone has them. Floating mics here. Or we could just break. No, Matt, go ahead. We'll do Matt's question, then we'll take a quick break and come back for the next panel.
Thank you all, and Dan sort of left that little teaser at the end, but I want to sort of ask the whole panel, what is the Codevilla, what is the Angelo teaching on replacement theory? Like, how do we get a new elite? What is the plan? I'd like to hear from all three.
You go first.
Well, one of the things that I would say about his answer to that question is it probably evolved quite a bit between when I first met him in 1995 and the answer that he'd give in 2020. I think he had a lot more hope that there could be kind of a Washington-based movement back in the mid-90s, that it was possible to gather together the right amount of people around a candidate and perhaps continue Reagan. I think the more that he saw failures in the 21st century, the more he was thinking longer game. He writes a lot more near the end of his career on the importance of K through 12 education, parental rights, parental choice, almost as if he realizes that almost a whole generation has to be built up to be able to appreciate what a leader like this might do. Said differently, metaphysically, the country is way out of whack. If you don't understand the difference between a male and a female, a woman and a man, how are you going to know the difference between a good candidate and a bad candidate? So you had to start with basics, McGuffey readers, phonics, how words actually mean something. They correlate to reality. Parents understanding those lessons, teaching those lessons to children, and the rebuilding of community from that ground level up. I think he was moving very much in that direction. When I took the position of a K through 12 headmaster, I thought he was going to be really mad at me. Instead, he said, I think this is a great move. This is where the future is in K through 12 education, which surprised me quite a bit.
Yeah, I'll try a little bit more. I was looking into my notes to try and find it in the updated edition of The Character of Nations. He starts off by saying, maybe it's the original preface too, I couldn't find my original copy. He said, I came to America and the American way of life has changed in ways that I could have thought unimaginable. How might it change yet again? And of course, you can make out a case for pessimism, of course, based on his realism. And here and there, though, there are hints that because arguably a majority of Americans resist what is being forced down their throat by the ruling elite to control the communications, control the cultural commanding heights, that there's still some hope when that exists. The problem is organizing that's difficult. I mean, the Tea Party kind of ran aground because it's just difficult to make that work very well. He does say at the very end of the book, you mentioned Kennan speculating on American secession or breaking apart, which is now a current topic, right? He says at the end, he's onto this possibility too. And he says, here's the last sentence of the book, but secessions, however numerous, and the countercurrents, however powerful and ominous, are no more than that. Even in America, there is only one regime at a time. So, I mean, I don't think he was not sort of I'm not sure this is right because it's not true certainly in foreign policy, but I don't think he was a sort of programmatic thinker about here's points 1 through 10 or a platform writer. But I do think that, and having in my talk talked about how he would have been skeptical of the phrase American exceptionalism as it is used, he does go on at great length to explain in substantive terms why America is different and exceptional and why those founding principles are still a reservoir on which hope rests. I can't really do much better than that, and I'm not sure he would want us to, because he'd want us to be grumpy and realistic about things.
And he mentions this on 4 or 5 occasions. I'm not going to provide for you in this book a list of recipes. That over and over and over again, what will he provide for us? Kind of an orientation toward these things.
Yeah, I wouldn't provide a laundry list of things that Angelo would focus on, but I will say I think there are three themes that do come through both in his books and in various remarks he made as to how we might start to create a better elite. One of them, which was very much central to David's remarks, involves philosophy. That the current elite, is very much a Machiavellian elite in all the worst ways, and we need to know Machiavelli and know Machiavellianism in order to take them on, but we can't stop there. So the first thing is to know your Machiavelli, but also go beyond that, go back to the classical tradition, go back to religious tradition. The second thing is localism, which again has been alluded to here. And this means getting more equal citizens involved in governing themselves. So Angelo, for example, wanted to break up school districts. He wanted to have many more school districts in the country in order to get many more citizens involved on their local school boards. So localism is, again, a way in which ordinary people who are equals among themselves can actually become rulers, can actually become self-rulers and participate in self-government. Then the third theme I would say is quite important to this, Codevillian idea of a new elite is merit. Angelo was very grateful that America was still a meritocracy when he came to our country, or at least was much more of a meritocracy than it is now. At a time when he seemed to have relatively few professional choices, he took the Foreign Service exam. And the Foreign Service exam at that time was almost purely meritocratic. It was not based on diversity requirements, for example. This gave him, an entree first into the Foreign Service, then later on to working for Senator Malcolm Wallop and becoming, the expert on foreign policy that we're going to hear about in the next session. So merit and exams, which have been very much under attack in our country in recent years, with universities after university trying to get rid of merit exams precisely because they know that these exams are antithetical to what they want to do with our country. I think Angelo would say bringing back merit is going to be very important, and that includes this upcoming Supreme Court decision where we think, or we hope, that there may be a rejection of current affirmative action practices in the universities.
Yeah, I'll just add before we break, a theme in my conversations with Angelo in the last couple years of his life was and sort of mid-Trump years, or latter Trump years, was the lack or the vacuum in national leadership. That there really was a huge opportunity, take the American constitutional equivalent of reaching down and picking up the crown with your sword, rhetorically, to use these grievances of the country class that had been sort of taken up by Trump, but failures of execution and all else not really capitalized upon, and to take the fact of the 18% approval rating of the federal government and to use those things as weapons. And part of the virtue of national leadership, we have a very corrupt and sclerotic federal bureaucracy which controls a lot of Washington and can stymie any president, especially presidents on the right. But national leadership does open up more space for a lot of these local solutions and rhetorical cover for them, and even spurs a lot of creative thinking on these fronts. So I think both are needed, and it's not hopeless. Well, thank you all. Let's break for 5 minutes and come right back.